All right, I believe the recording is on. Thanks everybody for joining. We have the first topic. Do we have Ben and Brian on the call to discuss this?
I mean, yeah, I'm here. I don't have much to add. I just had a little comment on the PR because it seemed like it solved a common problem we've been seeing around customers just getting worried when the re-entrants fail. So I don't know. I'd be more curious to hear from everybody else.
Yeah, so I've been looking at this a bit more, thinking about it. First of all, thanks for the PR, by the way. It's really good. A lot of hard work went into it. The thing that's tricky to me is, what are we actually trying to solve? I think most of my concerns are about the whole reconciliation of rules and the guardrails and whatnot. But in order to solve the problem that Brian's talking about, we actually don't need to change any rules. We'd simply need to not fail if the rules already exist. Is there anyone that actually wants to change the rules dynamically, or have we just kind of done it because people thought, maybe that was just like, is that actually a use case we care about, or did it just kind of happen to come to be?
Well, I was not expecting to discuss my VR, I did not know, but for sidecars, yes, you don't need reconciliation, you just need to, the rules are the same as the one that we would like, then we can skip the apply step altogether. So that one, it's safe to do, as long as the parsing doesn't throw false positive on the first run. Regarding reconciliation, I remember Ben that he wanted it especially for upgrade scenarios, not related to sidecars. And
okay, so like for ambient.
Yeah, and the current status of the PR, it disables reconciliation for sidecars in order to be safe. We don't need unless, well, normally we don't need reconciliation in sidecars. We may need it if we want to cover the scenario where the first execution failed and left an unclean state, but that is very niche. It's like the niche of a niche. So as of now, the assumption is the first run will succeed and the second will skip.
Okay. Yeah, I think so one thing that I am slightly concerned about is that we skip it for sidecars because we add a flag to the injection template. But for things like VMs, for example, we're changing the behavior there. If we just flip it so that it's a flag to opt in rather than a flag to opt out, then I think it would be a lot safer. I'm pretty sure that all my concerns are gone as long as we, one, knowing the context that for sidecars we don't need it and it was just for ambient, and then just make it so that it's entirely opt-in so that we don't accidentally run it on VMs. I think that's fine with me. I'm still a little worried about the guardrails thing if we start using it on ambient, but we don't need to block the whole PR on that. We can just discuss that more if we try and start dynamically reconciling for ambient. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for me it makes sense. Technically, we may also not add any guardrails, but that would require us to move to NF tables, which is very long term.
Right.
Because there we have the atomic property and we are fine. For VM, the reconciliation is technically enabled, should not be executed, because the VM will do a cleanup every time the service is stopped, which is also a problem by its own, because the restarting of the service will, I think, allow for traffic escape. On master.
It is definitely problematic.
But in theory, reconciliation should never be executed there, because you should never end up with an unclean state. But in order to be sure, I can add the flag also there, and so that we are 100% sure that it will not be performed.
Instead of adding the flag in all the places, can we just change the flag to be, instead of no reconcile, make it
reconcile. Yeah, I think it's feasible.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. And if we just flip the flag, I mean, I need to go review it again, but I'm pretty sure it will all be good. I've looked at it a few times, and then we can move forward on that.
Yeah, I will need to rebase, do some changes because it has been quite out of date now.
Yep.
But yeah, I will do these changes and then let's see. I don't know Ben's opinion on this. We may need to chat.
I think Ben and Brian are good with this, and it was only me that was stopping it. So I'll double check with Ben. I'll ask him.
No. I mean, with changing the reconcile default.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah.
That one I'm not sure.
Okay.
Because initially it was like that. It was opt-in.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's see. It allows us for a safer deployment, safer rollout of the feature. So it's okay, I think.
Okay. Cool. Awesome. Thanks. And I thank you for the change. I feel like you're only working on very hard, controversial features like this and dual stack. So it's appreciated for sure.
All right, thank you so much, Neil. I have a quick question. So do you need this function for sidecar or do you need this function for ambient? That wasn't clear to me.
We are mostly interested in sidecar.
Okay.
So reconciliation was technically not required for us, but I added it because after discussing with Ben, it made sense also for ambient.
Got it. Thank you. Does anyone have any other comment for this topic? Brian, are you good with this? I saw you give a good emoji earlier.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So we'll sync with Ben offline, and should be good. Okay, let's move to the next topic, which is okay. Let me catch up with John's comments. Don't fail if rules are already set. So fixes for sidecars. And then for ambient is if rules are set but need change them. So basically for ambient, we have a little bit more room to make changes. But for sidecar, we are a lot more conservative.
Yes, and one extra thing, if the rules in sidecar scenario, if the rules are not compatible with what we would like, then we also need to raise proper errors. As of now, we just throw failures because our operation cannot be executed twice. But the PR will also make it very explicit when an incompatible rerun is happening.
All right. Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, and shouldn't be a surprise to existing sidecar users. All right, let's moving on to, I don't think we have Zhonghu. Do we have Zhonghu? No, yeah, it's very late here, so we'll communicate through meeting notes to him. So I guess he's interested in status for MCS and should we remove it or should we keep it? Yeah, my understanding is it hasn't been maintained, but Keith, I'd like you to weigh in.
Sure. So and Jacek from Red Hat also mentioned that they're interested in this. I think this is something that we do want to, from Microsoft side, invest in and make sure that gets taken care of. The code hasn't been changed for a while, but there are tests from what I could see, integration tests as well as unit tests. There's some changes. I think Mike is pushing upstream for MCS API. And so the API itself might change, but Istio support, I think, is in a somewhat decent place from what I can tell. I don't see much breakage there. So I'm inclined to keep it. If there's any gaps, happy to invest the time to get those fixed or at tests or whatever we need. MCS API itself is still alpha, so Istio support can't really go past that. I think that might be one of the sources of confusion there. Microsoft is working to try to, along with other companies, to try to get MCS API to a higher stability. And then once that's done, happy to do what's necessary to get the Istio supports to match that.
So do we know the status of MCS implementation in Istio? Is experimental the right way to categorize it at the moment? That was my understanding, but happy to be corrected. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. John has a comment in the doc. There are a couple of different aspects to the MCS. There's the controller. There is so the controller. Istio I think is a full MCS controller. I think that's probably the most experimental part of the code base. There's also reading service imports as part of programming service endpoints and such. I think that's actually probably alpha-ish rather than experimental, but I need to double check. I don't know if John has any more context he'd like to add.
Yeah, I mean, what status it is, that's officially, I don't think anything's been declared alpha. So if we want to debate on how stable it is, that's another story. But there's lots of things. There's like, are we reading service imports? Are we creating service imports? Are we automatically exporting services to align with Istio? Are we replacing the Istio service discovery entirely with MCS, or just also supporting them? Like, there's all these different aspects of it. So I would caution about speaking too much about support for MCS without clarifying what we actually mean by that. There's also like the implementation of MCS in Istio. Like today, so I don't know if you recall the dual stack discussion, but the initial concern with dual stack was that, hey, we're going to take all the XDS we have and double it for the other IP family. There was the exact same concern. We resolved that for dual stack. There was the exact same concern for MCS that, hey, we're going to take all these services and spawn a copy of the XDS for MCS. And now it's doubled. And there was extra concern that we'd have them both on together, and we have 4x the XDS, which is obviously pretty terrible. So while we've addressed that for dual stack, we haven't for MCS. Whether we need to really depends on what we mean by MCS. So today, I don't know anyone using MCS at scale. Like on GK, for example, where MCS is probably arguably the most popular, they only support like exporting like 25 services or some small amount. People aren't using it as like, hey, I want to have all of my clusters and all my services, they're all multi-cluster. And it's just like the Istio multi-cluster, right? It's generally very, very case by case, often just for ingress for the front door, really. So at that scale, it's perfectly fine to do whatever we do today. But if we start to do, I want to use MCS as the multi-cluster solution in Istio and kind of replace the Istio mechanics, then it becomes quite a bit different in ergonomics and scalability.
So does it make sense to host the implementation in the ecosystem for now?
Well, again, it depends which part you're talking about. There's many parts, and some could be external and some cannot.
Now, is any of the parts useful for Istio? That's what I'm trying to get. Maybe the parts that exports at the gateway level, that's useful?
I mean, everything is, for some value of useful, is useful. Istio's MCS support came at a time where there were very few MCS controllers, from what I understand. So now you've got Karmata at the time. I think you had Admiral, Submariner is another one, but then you've got like the cloud providers, GCP and the Azure Fleet. I think Amazon's got some multi-cluster thing. But you may be deploying Istio in a place where you don't have a MCS controller. There's no canonical MCS controller implementation. So Istio being your MCS controller to sync your service exports to service imports, like convenient things like automatically exporting all your services to make it fit with the Istio model. to create because the Istio multi-cluster model is sort of different than the MCS API model. So like there are lots of components that exist in the code base today with varying degrees of stability, to John's point, to make MCS API work for a variety of use cases. I do agree we should probably try to do an audit of what exists and then strip those things that nobody wants. That seems like an easy one when it comes to limiting the complexity of the project. The things that are low instability and people do want need to probably come up with a plan or a timeline or something just so we don't have it permanently lingering around and just give it some owners, people to drive it forward.
Yeah,
And I think that's exactly what John just
I
wrote
agree
in
with
the
that.
text.
Yeah. Yep, I agree. Exactly what you said.
yeah, I think that sounds reasonable. By the way, I was just searching about docs. There's no mention of MCS. So basically, I don't believe users have been asking us about this. So I would love to see you guys come up with a doc, evaluate what you just said, Keith.
I feel like it was there years ago. It may have gotten removed, but I remember seeing
Yeah,
it.
it was removed. I think it was years ago. There was an experimental doc about it, but I couldn't find anything at the moment. So I don't think anybody uses, and I'd never seen people really ask like troubleshooting or debugging. So first you had to enable it. So most people won't use it unless they enable it. I think might be an environment variable to use it. And now we don't even teach people how to do it.
Well, part of the other issue is that for many years, MCS API was kind of none of the meshes supported MCS for the longest time. And even Istio was on the Vanguard, who did support it was on the Vanguard because it, meshes have to figure out how to do multi-cluster before MCS. And it it made some assumptions when it comes to how traffic should be routed across clusters that didn't really fit with meshes. None of those are really solved, but I think there's just the inevitability of Kubernetes having a standard API and the multi-cluster SIG having a little bit more life being brought into it right now. I think people are starting to take another look at it. Like notably Kuma and Linkerd both, I believe, have alternative multi-cluster implementations. So that's part of some of the lack of docs, lack of investment, because the community hasn't, like to this point, really coalesced on MCS API. I suspect that that's shifting. So another answer might just be
Okay, did you say Linkerd are also looking at this too? Potentially implemented in their service mesh?
the opposite, I think. I think Linkerd has their own multi-cluster setup similar to Istio.
Okay, yeah, because I'm curious if other service mesh are looking at implement, because I don't know if it's worthwhile to have Istio as the guinea pig, because that's another complexity added to Istio.
Yeah, I would love to know what the goals are, like the first step of this thing, because the only goals that I had personally been involved in the past were not really user-facing goals. They were more not user-facing goals, if you catch my drift. So it'd be interesting to see what the motivations are, because that will really help tie them. Like to Lynn's point, I think the reason we haven't seen a lot of users use it is it doesn't really make sense for most Istio users from a UX standpoint. I mean, there's plenty of issues with the Istio one. Like I do think there's good points about like the opt-in or more explicit control with MCS, but there's all sorts of major issues with MCS from a UX standpoint as a replacement for a service mesh. So it would be good to understand what our goal is. And that goal probably should not be to make it the one true multi-cluster solution for Istio, which I don't think is being pushed here, but correct me if I'm wrong. But there are still maybe other reasons to support it. So
Yeah, just for complete transparency, my motivation from a Microsoft perspective is I want for users to be able to put Istio into a multi-cluster product like Azure Fleets or the GCP MCS product or whatever it is, and have Istio be able to understand the service topology and have the semantics match enough to where I'm not disrupted. That vision and that goal that I have personally probably means that we can take a lot of the stuff out of Istio. Notably, I don't know that it makes sense in 2024 for Istio to have a for Istio to have a full MCS API implementation. Or controller implementation specifically, but we can have that conversation as we go through the process.
All right, sounds good. So Keith, I kind of write down the decision. We'd love to have a plan and goal here and assessment on the current API and implementation. Does that sound reasonable, or is there anything more we want to discuss on this topic?
No,
All
let's talk
right,
about retries.
All right, let's move on to retries. John, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion going on of late about kind of revamping retries in Istio. I believe there's 3 aspects to this. Let me write them down here. So one is a new inbound reset or retry policy. This is already merged to retry reset connections. I believe is that accurate, Keith? You were the one that did it, right?
Yeah, it's retry connections that are reset before the request propagated to the upstream. So it's called reset before request.
Okay. Yeah, and then the next part is this PR, which is outbound retries. Stop retrying 503s because it's not really a safe default, given that we have no idea whether the requests are idempotent or not. And then there's also a final proposal to default idle timeout to 5 seconds on inbound to avoid issues when connecting to apps where they close a connection before we detect it. We try and send the request and it fails, which is a fairly common source of 503s. And notably, this should make it so that the previous change is less impactful because we don't really get 503s as much. Before I go any further on the motivations and what we should do, Keith, is this actually an accurate assessment of all the changes that we're talking about proposing?
Specifically, I think the first point, the proposal is to make the reset before request the default inbound retry policy. Other than that, I think that's correct.
Yeah, okay. So the question is, should we do all this? Because it is changing the default of the retry policy that's been there for quite a long time. Retry policy is, a pretty big thing in Istio. Just to be clear as well, if this is talking about only the defaults, obviously people can go configure retries however they want, both in mesh config as a mesh level default and in virtual service on a per service basis. And we will also put this behind the compatibility profile flag, etc. So I wanted to bring this up because on the PR, it was specific requests, we brought it up, and I think it's a good topic of conversation. I personally kind of lean towards yes, we should do it. I mean, certainly if I was designing Istio from day 0 right now, I would do it. I think I would even probably not have retries on by default at all, maybe. No, I guess it's useful for now that we remove the 503s. So maybe my knowledge is tainted. But it's, I think it really makes sense that if, you should really opt into a legitimate request that made it to the destination being retried, which is kind of the direction we're going here. So I want to open the floor to other opinions, though.
Okay, so we do retry twice by default, if I remember correctly. So
Yep.
my question is, how do you know which 503 retry are safe, which are unsafe? Because I remember the logs a lot of time are like upstream connection error. What if the destination path was trying to restart or shut down? I mean, how do we differentiate? Because there may be some scenario that user do want to retry for. I don't exactly know if those would be 503. I guess, oh, can we say 503 is always unsafe? That's what I'm not sure.
Yeah, so it depends. So when Envoy makes a connection to something and it fails, so okay, when Envoy is responding to an HTTP request, it has to give an HTTP status code, right? And so it usually gives 503 for basically every error. So if I go connect to some random server and that server refuses my connection, I'm going to return a 503, but I'm not applying a retry policy against the 503. The 503 is my response. It's not the response I got from the upstream connection. It's the downstream response. So in that case, it's not like the retry policy being removed from 503 doesn't matter here. It would actually be retrying against one of the connection refused or whatever the name is for the policy. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Now the issue is that on the inbound side, like we generally have sidecars on both ends. And so if the inbound sidecar gets a connection refused, it's going to report a 503. And the outbound sidecar actually gets that 503. And so it would retry against the 503 policy. So it's not like we know, like, I got a 503 and that 503 was because the connection refused. We just see we got a 503. So that's why this outbound change and the inbound changes kind of go hand in hand. The reason we had the 503 retry policy, as I understand it, was largely to gloss over issues with Istio causing like errors like this, right? But if we do this retry policy on the inbound side, if we do this default idle timeout change, then we're less likely to have those issues on the inbound sidecar, which means we're less likely to get 503s that are not really 503s, but they had to be. And so it should be less impactful. This kind of sounds like unexplainable. So hopefully that made sense. A whiteboard would make this much more clear, but.
So it sounds like this is a breaking change for users that for some reason have their own 503 scenario that they particularly want retried. We would see a behavior change for them. But it strikes me that that's sort of what compatibility versions were meant to address. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And it's also, like, in this case, it's pretty easy to swap because there's already in mesh config a cluster-wide default retry policy. So if they do see, like, hey, I legitimately wanted my own app's 503s to be retried, they can go set the policy. 503 is not a super common error outside of Istio as well. So I would expect that if they did want to retry their app's errors, maybe they wanted other things other than 503s as well, like 500s. And maybe are already setting those explicitly. They also maybe don't want to do it at the mesh level, but maybe at the virtual service level, because some apps you want to retry, you probably don't want them on all of them. So I would say yes, like this is exactly the type of change compatibility versions was meant for.
Am I correct?
Yeah, 503s are. Oh, go ahead, Ben.
I was going to say, am I correct that this is changing a default, right? So you can still retry 503s if you want. We are just not going to do it implicitly without you telling us. Okay. Yeah, or without telling you about it. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I think
503s are unique enough that every time I see them, I start to panic a little bit at this point. Sorry, Lynn, did you have something to say?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say I think compatibility version definitely makes sense. My main concern is, I don't want people install Istio to the newer version and have the default with the 503 retry disabled and find out their traffic might working differently. That's the only concern. Yeah.
Speaking of which, I think we should probably begin messaging about compatibility modes a little bit more aggressively. I don't think we've had any major behavior changes tucked behind them, but we've talked about some. And it's one of those things that we've released it now, and if it goes, say, a year without any changes being introduced behind it, users get used to not using it and ignoring it, and then all of a sudden we decide to make use of it and it causes problems. So I'm in favor of some of these small changes being tucked behind compatibility modes and really having probably for every release like, here's what changes to this compatibility mode, here's how you avoid it. Get that message out front frequently to our users to build in that good behavior, because when we change things like cluster.local, it's going to be a big problem if users aren't making use of compatibility mode.
I agree, but I think you might be surprised to find how many changes we've made. I'm looking at the oldest compatibility version. We actually have 10 changes behind it, and some of them are not small. Like we did the whole external name change was big. Started verifying the TLS and destination rule. Delta XDS, removed Zipkin as a default tracer. Like pretty non-trivial changes. But I think what we're missing is probably like a dedicated section on the release notes where it's like every release, here's what is added to the compatibility profile, and like just kind of in your face every time.
That sounds great.
Yeah, for what it's worth, when I write release notes, I try to, or specifically upgrade notes, I try to tell people, hey, this is what changed. If you want to opt into the old behavior or opt out of this change, you can use this compatibility version. But agree a dedicated section would make it easier to grok against that whole wall of text.
Yeah, I thought we were pretty clear, but maybe not.
It's decently, yeah. I mean, most of them, but like we could just easily have. Actually, it's better than I thought. I was just thinking like a table that's like, it's not a big deal.
Particularly with open source, where we throw stuff out into the void and expect our users to read it. I think it's helpful to say something at least 10 times. I still run into users, I ran into one this week, who are unaware that Istio supports skip version upgrades. That was added in Istio 1.8, which I think was late 2020. So it's been more than almost 4 years at this point. And the fact of the matter is, when I go to upgrade Docker, I don't think I've ever read the release notes. I just sort of upgrade and move on. It's not something I want to spend a lot of time thinking about. I think that's the same headspace a lot of our users are in or would like to be in. So it really helps for us to say the same thing over and over again until eventually it sort of propagates into everyone's awareness.
Yeah, agreed. By the way, I checked every single section we have. We did tell people about compatibility version. So
Excellent.
all right. Sounds like people are okay if we put in the compatibility version. And I'm reading it as the maintainers, John, that ask you to put this forward. I think Rama is also in favor of this. I guess Zhonghu was a little bit concerned. That's how I read it. Is that how you get that too?
Yeah, though I don't know if Zonghu specifically is concerned with the change or just the change not being discussed more thoroughly. Could be either one. We can talk to him some more. It sounds like most of the people on this call were leaning towards doing it. Lynn, you were the only one that expressed some concern. How strong is that concern, or is it concerned but we should do it, or concerned you don't think we should do it?
I mean, I mean, it sounds like it's useful to do, but you know, it's harder. I don't think our test would catch something like this in our integration test, to my understanding. So unfortunately, to me, this is pretty hard to hit when you, unless you're running like a real environment with different app, or, you know, different scenario. Yeah. Would you agree? We don't really have much test coverage to test this,
That is
to
true.
help, yeah, to
One
help
thing we
us
have
kind of decrease concerns.
is, yeah, some of these changes are already in 123 off by default, and then we have some people who regularly experience retry behaviors in real world that are trying them out. Actually, Carl from AutoTrader, and I think someone else said they were as well. Which is the best way to get kind of this real world experience. No matter, like, we will never ever have a test that properly covers the full gambit of the implications of retry policies on applications, because it's totally specific to all these quirks of different applications.
Yes, totally.
So getting that real world testing is pretty important.
Did you say Carl already tried 123 builds?
No, I don't think he's tried it yet, but he's going to. Like, we have it off in 123. He will turn it on in 123, give us feedback, and then we can go from there for if we were to do this, we would turn it off by default in 123, on by default in 124, so we can get feedback before we actually ship it. And we'll get that from the early adopters of 123.
Okay, yeah, I like that. Go ahead, sorry.
So, quick question. For what use cases we have discovered the retries are unsafe? Like in most cases, at least the mesh that we run, we have found since 503s are an error that occurs within Envoy, in most cases it's safe unless application starts throwing 503, which in our cases they rarely do. So I'm curious if we have discovered cases where we deem.
Yeah, I can give an example. Like, say I send a request and it says to send, I don't know, a missile to, no, I don't want to use that example. It sends an email. The app processes it, it sends the email, it's about to respond, and it disconnects from Envoy for whatever reason. Envoy says, oh, it disconnected, I'm going to respond with 503. We say, oh, 503, let's retry that. We go to a different server, we send the email twice. It doesn't even have to be the app sending a 503. It could just be the app failing for some reason that triggers Envoy to send the 503. Or it could be the app sending the 503. I agree, like most apps don't send 503s.
Yeah.
But apps can do things that cause Envoy to send it even after they've processed it. That's why we added this retry policy, which is reset before the request was even sent. Because if the app ever gets the request, then it could be unsafe. There's the possibility.
Yeah.
But if it never gets a request, it's always fine to retry. So
right. So with that, like, do you expect in most cases, like, it's probably safe, and there are these edge cases. So maybe like people who don't want this behavior, they can turn off versus we changing the default.
yeah, I mean, the idea here is that we should do the safe thing by default, and if you want unsafe behavior, you should opt into it, right?
We don't know your apps, right? We don't know which app it would be safe to turn it on for and which app it would be safe to turn it off for. Only you, the operator, know that. We can't guess.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
So Samit, are you a Istio user?
No, we are migrating to Istio slowly, but we run our own control plane, and we've been running Envoy for 6-7 years now.
I see. Yeah, because I don't know if you caught what John mentioned for 1.23, which is our upcoming release. We don't plan to change the behavior, but you could potentially try it in 1.23, and then we're hoping you or maybe auto traders and some of the other users could try it so that we have more confidence. And then in 1.24, we can change the default. So if you are in the process of trying Istio, this would be good for us to get some feedback.
Sounds good.
All right, thanks so much for joining too. Should we move on? We have 15 minutes. We still have like 3 topics. Leo, I think you are up
Yes.
next. Yeah, go
Yes,
ahead.
yeah, this will be fast. So in 1.21, we deprecated, we remove pilot enable inbound pass-through flag, the environment variable. But then a user complained and said that the FM was Rama that they still use it for security reasons. So this was added back as part of the API. But the commit that added back was only included in 1.22. So as of now, 1.21 doesn't have the feature at all. I know that we are quite late in the release cycle for 1.21, but I was wondering if it makes sense to backport it, although it is an API change. The changes itself is small, but still API change, so we need to be careful.
So it's an API change. Basically, we don't normally do cherry picking, but in this particular case, my understanding is it's a regression. So it sounds like Istio break it for you. Is that fair?
No, that's not really true. There was a feature flag that was present but deprecated for many, many releases and it was removed. And then there was a new API feature that was added. I mean, I get from a user standpoint, it is like there's a gap in the functionality existing, but like from an Istio perspective, it is a long deprecated field was removed and then a new API was added. So it's.
But currently 1.21 users have none of those options, because in the deprecated one was removed and the replacement was never added.
Yeah, but
in that release.
I guess who is impacted by this? Is there someone that's using this functionality that has to use Istio 1.21?
Well, internally in Ericsson, we rely on it for legacy applications. It's not a problem for us to revert internally, but I was wondering if I should do the revert also officially. There was another user that complains in another post, in another issue, that this feature was removed and not replaced. But then he said, okay, then I will skip to 1.22 instead. So he jumped the release.
Yeah, I mean, definitely what we would do with anything is to revert the removal, not to backport the addition of the new API, because we don't do new APIs in patch releases. Whether it's worth it or not, I don't know. It is a small change, so.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it is worth, but yeah, I guess we can backport, revert the removal for that release only, so no API is affected, and yeah. If that is fine for everyone, I can do that.
So when you say no API is affected, we're still adding back in the API of this environment variable, is that right?
So we will, we could bring back the environment flag that was removed, and we bring it back only for 1.21. From 1.22 and newer releases, we still have the replacement, the official one, so we don't need to re-add the removed flag there. So 1.22 and newer, they will use the mesh config API.
I'm asking because effectively we've got sort of two of our project principles are conflicting with one another. The first is that we should not deprecate things without there being a path forward for them, or in this case, it sounds like we kind of walked back the deprecation, but said there's a better way to enable it. So So that's sort of one of the principles we need to pay attention to. The other is that we don't make changes like this in exist in patches.
Mhm.
Given that we've heard from 2 users who make use of this relatively obscure alpha level API, I would be hesitant to make any changes to the patch release, which, if they go wrong, have the potential to impact all users of Istio 121. Particularly when it's only one version, and as you mentioned, they can go from 120 directly to 122, and everything will continue functioning. That's just kind of my leaning, but we do have kind of 2 of our principles in conflict here.
Yeah, I mean, one thing users need to understand is that the Istio environment variables are temporary flags. If you're using one, you're always using an API that has a shelf life. It's always going to be removed. That's the intent of environment variables. And so you either need to have a plan to move off it very quickly or a plan to convince Istio not to remove it and make it a first-class thing. And the convincing works a lot better before it's removed. Like the sooner the better, right? What we often see is that something just like this, we've seen even worse where it's like, oh, I wanted to upgrade to Istio 1.19, which is now long end of life, but it removes some feature flag. It's like, there's literally nothing we can do. Like we don't build Istio 1.19 anymore. Even if we wanted to add it back, it's just not something we can even do. So there's kind of a shared responsibility when you're using experimental features to give feedback early instead of late. And that's really the problem here. It's not even that a feature was removed and then added back. No, an experiment was dropped and then a feature was added. And they happen to do the same thing, but they're really orthogonal. And only one of them has compatibility claims. So, I mean, I'm personally not super against, like, it's a small flag. If it's going to unblock your users to add it back in 121, it's not such a big hassle. I'm not super opposed to it, but we need to have like a, expectation of what environment variables are and how they need to be handled by users.
John, I would agree. If we have a very high degree of confidence in the safety of this change, like a 99.99% confidence that this is not going to cause problems for other users, then we can probably break the policy. We just have to be aware that we are risking all users for what sounds like 2 users. So,
But wait,
but like I said, if there's
this,
a high confidence, then maybe we should do it.
maybe I'm missing something. So first of all, I'm not advocating for either direction. I just want to clarify on your comments, Mitch. I think this flag doesn't mean user going to enable it by default. Is it correct this flag was off before?
Yes, in order to change behavior, you need to opt in. So
Okay,
by
so
default,
yeah.
you will not notice changes. Yeah.
Yeah, so probably most
Yeah,
of the users are not using it.
No, they're still at risk though. Any code change, even if it's disabled by default, is still at risk, right?
That
Yeah,
is true.
that's
Yeah,
my
I just want
concern.
to
Is not it's
clarify.
not so much that I think that there's actual default changes or behavior changes that users who adopt this are going to see unless they specifically opt in. It's simply that anytime we mutate a patch, we're introducing or risk that we're asking all of our Istio users to take on. And so as a rule, we only do that when it's a serious bug that we expect a substantial portion of our users really need the fix for. In this case, it's not a bug and it's only 2 users. But again, if we have high confidence on the change, we can move forward. I don't mean to be holding things up unnecessarily.
No. This is why we're having this discussion. So 121 is going to be out of support, not very long. So Leo, from your perspective, do you see any blocker for your team to update to 122? So you won't rely on
Technically,
experimental.
we cannot upgrade yet to 1.22 internally, but we are also fine if the flag is if there is no replacement for it in 1.21, because we can add it back internally.
Okay, well, that may be a
So-
better solution for now, just adding it internally so it doesn't carry cost for the release and all the other users out there. I didn't know you were building internally. So would you be okay with that?
Yeah, we are good with that. But I decided just to bring it forward because it happened for this flag. It was unfortunate that it happened, but that the branch was cut just before the commit that had the mesh config option was merged. But okay, then we agree to not backport anything or restore revert anything, and user will skip to 1.22 if they need this flag or this knob to control the functionality.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you for understanding. I hope the explanation from the team, from John and Mitch, was helpful, and hopefully you guys will have more strategic planning regarding using environment variable in the community, and also help us promote some of the environment variable to proper API if it's truly important to you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, with that, I'd like to, we have a few minutes. Ian, John, does any of your topic super important, or can be covered in the next 3-4 minutes?
I mean, I can just, it won't thoroughly be covered, but just inspired by this conversation was about whether we should remove the older compatibility versions. And if we do, should we also remove all the flags from Istio D? For some of them, I'm kind of leaning towards some of them. Specifically, the auto SNI one has some issues still that we're working out. So I think maybe leave that, but remove the profile. But TBD, just think about it and we can discuss it either next week or leave comment there or on Slack or something. Not urgent at all. But we can probably get through Ian's at least briefly.
Yeah, so we can at least bring it up for awareness and maybe discuss more in the ambient call. But we recently created a new controller that will assign IPs to service entries, and it will persist them in status. And the way it works as it sits right now is it will assign like a dual stack pair of IPs for each service entry. But the way the original auto allocation works is it assigns those IPs per model.service, which is an internal type that does not allow multiple hosts. And so it's effectively a auto-assigned IP per host in your service entry. And that makes like this weird rub with the way the V2 allocation is working. So proposing a change so that we can basically pair up a IP that is auto-assigned to an individual host in the service entry and keep track of those so that they don't shift around wildly. So yeah, I threw out a change, and there's an example of what I think it might look like in the PR. And then I'm going to work on the Istio D updates anyway, so that we can like at least validate that this does what it says on the tin.
All right,
So yeah,
thank you.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
So the call to action is ask people to review the PR. Yes.
Yeah, if you're specifically interested, go for it. And if you're interested and would like further discussion, maybe we can do that right now, I guess, on the ambient call.
Yes. So John, I don't think we have time for discussion your topic. If needed, maybe we can bring back next week. And Marian, I don't think we have time.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I just added it there. I'll bring it up next week.
Okay, can you topics so we'll discuss next week?
Sounds good. Yeah.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.